Welcome back from the break. I hope you had time to stretch your legs and maybe get something to drink. Okay, so let's carry on and have a look at our next theorist that we're going to study is Darwin, and let's see about that one. Okay, so it's also one of the It's also one of the theories of evolution, and here specifically we're now going to have a look at Darwin. And Darwin's theory we call natural selection. So that already tells us that it's more in the natural, so there's factors from the environment that would then affect it. So let's have a look. Okay, so his theory of evolution by natural selection was basically a concept that he developed based on observations that he made on his journey around the world. So what happened is, as a young man, he started studying medicine, and then he didn't like that, so then he went on to study theology, and he didn't like that. So what happened is, and in those days, the eldest son usually took over from the father, so he would inherit the land or whatever. And Darwin wasn't the eldest son, so he then joined an expedition or a journey on a ship called the HMS Beagle, and he traveled around the world. And while on his travels, on the journey, and those journeys took very many months and sometimes years, they stopped at a lot of places along the way. And what he did is he observed, because he was interested in nature and in the natural environment, he started making notes, he started making observations, he did diagrams. And then from those observations and interesting things that he saw, he then put forward his theory. And we call it the theory of natural selection. So in other words, what he said is that natural selection is one of the basic concepts, and it's based on 4 observations that he saw when he was traveling around the world. And these observations are the following. The first one is variation. And we know that variation, so we know it's, when we talk about variation, organisms, there's lots of different organisms. So there's biodiversity of organisms. But there's also not only biodiversity, there is also in a population. So in one population, we also find differences. Okay, so we might see some organisms that have a lighter color or a darker color or taller. So in one population, there is also variety. And this is the variation he was talking about. So not all the organisms of a population look all exactly the same. Okay, and we also learned, we know where genetic variation comes. It comes with sexual reproduction. Then, because of that variation, or in that variation within a population, there's lots of offspring that are produced. So they don't just produce a few offspring, there are lots produced. And when there are lots of organisms, it's going to increase competition. And they're going to compete for natural resources. So they're going to then compete with each other for food, for space, food, water, space, even mating partners. So that competition would then increase. So as they get older, they would then compete for all of those things. And then he noticed that there are different characteristics, and those characteristics obviously are linked to variation. So as soon as we have variation, that means then that organisms would have these various characteristics. And we know this, we've learned about genetics, we know that there are characteristics, or a gene for a characteristic may have different forms, such as blue eyes and brown eyes and green eyes and whatever. So that he noticed that. And then what he noticed is that some characteristics are suitable in an environment and some characteristics are not. All right, and then the last point or the last observation he made is that based on those characteristics, okay, certain organisms or certain of the, well, let's call them organisms because he looked at animals and plants, certain of the organisms survive and others don't. All right, so those were his observations, and then he drew up his theory based on that. Okay, so let's have a look in a little bit more detail. Okay, so if we can have a look, and this is a very nice diagram here. We can see that in this example, we're using butterflies, and in this population of butterflies, there's variation. Okay, so there we can see there's variation. We have yellow butterflies here, and we have brown butterflies here, and so there is genetic variation within the population. Okay, now when those butterflies as adults, when they reproduce, they produce many offspring. You can see there are many offspring that are produced, more than is needed for survival of the population or the species. So we have lots and lots of offspring that are produced, and that leads to competition. Because all of those little offspring or all of those new generation, they need food, they need space, they need water, they need whatever resources to be able to survive. So there will be competition for them. And then what happens is we can see there are different characteristics in the offspring. We can see here there are green and blue worms, and these ones are brown and yellow. And those are sort of maybe yellow and bluish green, and then the brown. And when in the natural environment, we see that it's the brown worms that seem to camouflage nicely against the tree, whereas this greenish, bluish worm here stands out and is very conspicuous. So that predators, which are these birds, they can see those worms, those offspring a lot more clearly than they can see the ones that are camouflaged on the bark of the tree. So those individuals then, these ones obviously don't have a favorable characteristic, whereas the ones that camouflage well, they are able to, they then have the favorable characteristic. And so they then survive in the environment, and what happens is they then are able to reproduce or to mature, and when they mature, they obviously develop into butterflies, and here you can see it's the brown butterflies that then become more dominant in the population. So over time, more and more of this variety of butterfly, the brown one, that is nicely camouflaged in the environment, then becomes the dominant phenotype in a population. And that's how we get the change or natural selection taking place. Okay, so let's look at each point now in detail. All right, so how does natural selection work? Okay, let's look specifically. So we said initially there is a great deal of variation. Okay, so there's lots of different forms or varieties in the offspring. They don't all look exactly the same. It was sexual reproduction in these organisms that took place, and we know as soon as sexual reproduction takes place, there's a lot of genetic variation that can happen. All right, so there's variation in the offspring. Some have a favorable characteristic, and some do not. So those that, depending on the environmental conditions that we have or that those organisms live in, there are some characteristics that would make them better suited for those environmental conditions. And then there are those that are not so well suited, and that is what happens in a population. All right, so here we can see our example again is we've got the yellow butterfly and the brown butterfly, so there is genetic variation within that population. All right, so when there's a change, so that's important, as soon as there's a change in the environmental conditions. So as soon as the conditions then favor a certain characteristic or one of the forms of the characteristic, it is then that and there's competition for food space and those kind of things, as I said, then certain organisms will survive and others won't. All right. So here we can see there's lots of offspring, and now there's lots of competition between all these organisms because of overproduction, and that then now becomes competition for survival. Right, then the organisms with the characteristics which make them more suited. So those ones that are better suited in the environment, okay, to the new environment or to the competition, they survive. And when they survive, obviously, they're going to then continue in their life cycle and they will then become sexually mature. And once they are sexually mature, then they can reproduce. Okay, so there we can see then when they reproduce, they are passing on their favorable characteristic. All right, but those organisms, so those organisms with the unfavorable characteristic, in other words, that characteristic which doesn't allow them to be suited to the environment. So in our example of the worms where we had the brightly colored greeny, yellow, blue worm as opposed to the brown worm, and they live in trees, on the stem of a tree, then that would not be suitable. Okay, so they then become conspicuous. They're not nicely camouflaged, so the predators, the birds, can see them, and they then are easily visible, and then the birds eat them. So they then would die off. Right, so here we can see, already we can see that there are more of those organisms with the favorable characteristic and only a few with the unfavorable characteristic because they become very conspicuous and predators can pick them off very easily. All right, so that means that more offspring in the next generation. Okay, so now we're talking about the next generation of worms, and they would have the advantageous characteristic or the favorable characteristic, because in that set of circumstances or those environmental conditions, that then is the favorable characteristic. So now the next generation inherits those favorable characteristics from the parents, and these differences then accumulate. Okay, so as each generation goes on, because there are more and more offspring in a population with that specific characteristic that are able to survive, and they then reproduce and they would pass on that characteristic. So eventually all the individuals in a population will have the new characteristic or trait. And that is how natural selection takes place. Right, so there we can see in our diagram very nicely, we can see that we have more of the brown butterflies than the yellow and blue butterfly. All right, so, and eventually that yellow, there might come a time when there are no more of the yellow variation in a population. And if somebody had to ask, what does the population, or what does it look like? What does the butterfly look like? People might say they're brown. And then conditions might change. And in a couple of years, we find we've got actually yellow butterflies. And that's because the conditions have now changed, and the characteristic for yellow actually became the favorable again. So natural selection works in where the environment provides the selective pressure for a specific characteristic to either be favorable or unfavorable. And if it's favorable, it would be selected for, and if it's unfavorable, it's selected against, and those organisms then would die out in those specific environmental conditions. Okay, so to quickly sum up Darwin's theory of natural selection, we know in his 4 observations that there was variation in a population. This led to competition. There were certain characteristics that were favorable and unfavorable, and then the favorable characteristic would be selected. And that is how natural selection works. Okay, so let's take a break. see if you can stretch your legs and get something to drink, and we'll see you after the break.